Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is a remastering of the beloved cult classic from 2010. Released on May 29, 2020 for the Nintendo Switch, the game features all of the content from the original game redone with crisp HD visuals. It also includes a brand new epilogue chapter and several quality of life improvements, including time trials, vanity options, and UI upgrades. I was a huge fan of the original game, so I was really excited when this got released. I don't play a lot of JRPGs, so saying that I really like this game means a lot coming from me. So I thought I'd talk about it. Without further ado, here's why I love Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Developed by Monolith Soft for the Nintendo Wii, the original Xenoblade Chronicles released in Japan in 2010, before coming to the US in 2012. The game also got a Nintendo 3DS port in 2015, along with two indirect sequels, one in 2015 for the Wii U, and another in 2017 for the Nintendo Switch. The game opens to two giants brawling it out in an eternal duel: the Bionis, a biologically based earthy being, and the Mechanis, a giant mechanical robot. The two eventually slay each other before giving birth to new forms of life that take root and live on their bodies. The main species we're introduced to in the beginning are the Hams, a fancy new term for humans, and the Mechons, evil machines that attack and eat the inhabitants of the Bionis. After a year-long period of peace, we set out with our main character and blonde British boy, Shulk, to defeat the robot menace, master the legendary sword, the Monado, and bring peace back to his small colony. Along with the quality of life improvements, the biggest draw of the Definitive Edition is the brand new original story, Future Connected, which, unlike the last two entries to the series, is a direct follow-up to the story of the original game. First, let's tackle why I love the original game before diving into its sequel chapter. My biggest problem with a lot of JRPGs is that most of them are heavily menu-based, and while a lot of them do have some pretty in-depth planning and strategy packed in, for most of them you kinda just end up picking the strongest attack you have and then spamming it until the fight's over. Repeat this hundreds of times and you've got yourself a game, but a boring one. But with Xenoblade Chronicles, you're constantly on your feet and dishing out attacks. Instead of a context menu, the combat is controlled by player positioning, auto-attacking, and a series of special attacks called combat arts. Each combat art works in a cooldown, and by fulfilling a set of conditions for each one, you can use them to deal significant damage or otherwise change up the fight in meaningful ways. Each character in the game plays differently. The protagonist, Shulk, excels by flanking enemies from different sides before unleashing his abilities, while his best friend Ryan's job is to keep all the aggro off of his teammates as the tank. It's a lot of fun, and always has you on your feet and thinking about your next move. My problem with a lot of games that try this style is that usually the spells just feel like you're mashing the button to use it as soon as it comes off cooldown, and most of your attacks just kind of feel the same. You usually have projectiles and strong attacks, but they all kind of feel like you're using the same move with different numbers. But in this game, each combat art is fun and unique to use, and it's really important to consider when and how you use each one. For example, the best character in the game, Melia, has an ability that inflicts the enemy with a very slight debuff. By using her Starlight Kick immediately afterwards, Melia drop kicks the enemy and topples them, which not only interrupts their current attack, but also stuns them for a couple of seconds. This move's already very satisfying to use on its own, and you could just spam it as soon as it comes up like you would in most other games. But if you wait and use it at just the right moment, you can actually interrupt an attack and potentially save your team from massive damage. Even Shulk, who in my opinion has one of the simpler movesets of the game, is still a ton of fun to control. You could just mash all your buttons as soon as they come off cooldown for some meager damage, but by getting into the right position and really thinking about how you use each one, you'll pop off a lot more damage in fights. You're constantly moving around and thinking about what to do next, and it provides for a really satisfying experience that I just haven't found in most JRPGs. It also plays really well into the game's other main mechanic, the ability to see the future. Sometimes the screen will freeze and you'll see an enemy charging up to use a powerful attack. This attack can potentially wipe your entire team in one hit if you're not careful. You then have a couple of seconds to try and figure out how to stop that future from coming true. You can stun the enemy, dodge the attack, try and kill them before the move comes out. It's a lot of fun and it requires quick thinking and careful planning so that your relevant attacks aren't on cooldown when it comes out. It's also just really satisfying to land that topple right before the enemy attack connects. The combat's one of my favorite things about this game, but what really drives the game along is the story and its beautiful characters. I'm about to enter spoiler territory, so if you haven't beaten the game yet, I highly advise you do so before you continue. The story is really long, with around 11 hours of cutscenes, and the main game took me around 70 hours to complete. Plus, there's still a ton of side and post-game content that I didn't even get to. But what really drives this mammoth of a game forward is the interesting, plot-twisted story and the lovable cast that you'll meet along the way. Each of the characters is very interesting, and none of them really got on my nerves too much throughout the story. Even the game's comic relief character, Ricky, has some surprisingly deep moments with the rest of the cast. One of my favorite traits of the characters is the cheesy yet endearing voice acting.
Our home. It's been occupied by the Mekon.
No.
It's cheesy, yeah, but in a fun way. But the story and the gameplay have been around since 2010, so what makes this definitive edition so, well, definitive? The immediate answer is the graphic upgrades. Maybe it's just because I'm used to how Shulk looked in his Smash Bros. Render, but man, I cannot believe the game used to look like this. They don't even look like the same character anymore. The graphics have been completely overhauled into HD, and I gotta say, the end result is truly impressive. Xenoblade already has some unique and beautiful environments, but the graphics upgrade really packs a punch to make them shine even brighter. My favorite looking area is the Satoru Marsh. Not a lot of swamp levels in games look very unique or interesting in any way, but the way that the lights come alive and make the entire area glow at night made this area a joy to traverse through. Other than the graphics, the game received some huge UI upgrades. Not many of them immediately jumped out at me to mention. The game just looks a lot more polished and modern, but by far my favorite part is the new Vanity Gear section. Vanity Gear allows you to equip your character with the stats of one piece of armor, but the appearance of another. This feature is so underrated, and I wish that every game with unique looking armor had this. Since you naturally want to equip the strongest armor possible at all times for fights, in most games your character ends up looking kinda silly. But since you can switch out the appearance at will in this game, you're instead able to customize your look however you want at any time. It really adds an extra sense of expression into the game that doesn't detract in any meaningful way. So that's Xenoblade Chronicles, but what about its DLC upgrade, Future Connected? A one-chapter story upgrade to a 10-year-old game always sounds pretty risky. Plus, I had read around the web that it was kinda lackluster. So because of this, I went in with pretty low expectations. But truth be told, I was really surprised by how much I liked it. Future Connected takes place a year after the original game, with just Melia and Shulk setting out on a quest to see what became of Melia's homeworld Alchemoth. Along the way, you're joined by two of Ricky's kids, Nene and Kino, who take the roles of the original game's Ryan and Charla. It seemed odd to me to insert these characters instead of bringing back the original Ryan and Charla, but narratively I guess it makes enough sense. The narrative is highly focused on Melia and her closure after the original story, so throwing in too many of the original cast might have detracted from that. Future Connected plays out in a very similar way to the original game, but with a few minor differences. Again, most of your party members are gone, so you'll have to pick between Shulk, Melia, Nene, and Kino. Your character's ultimate attacks are also changed. In the original game, the strongest move your character could use was called a chain attack. By building good team comps and chaining together moves of the same type, you could dish out ridiculously high damage numbers. But in Future Connected, you instead use a system called Union Strikes, which I thought was actually a fun little mechanic. Scattered throughout the level are Nopon explorers who give out side quests. Completing these quests allow that Nopon to join your team, and the more Nopons you have, the more damage your Union Strikes will do. The Union Strikes are extremely simple, boiled down to a point of basically pressing the big damage button or the big heal button. But collecting all of the Nopons to build your team was a lot of fun, and watching you and the squad roll out was pretty entertaining. The map is much smaller this time around, which I actually really appreciated. It felt like a good yet self-contained little chunk of gameplay and story. When you're working with a smaller map, you have the ability to more intricately craft level design, which in my opinion leads to much more interesting environments. One thing I found myself doing in this game that I didn't in the base game was seeing a Nopon flag or an interesting area off in the distance, and then having to figure out how to get there. Instead of just following the dotted line on the minimap like you did in the original game, you now have to look around and explore to get to where you want to go. It's a small change, but it really added a feeling of exploration as opposed to just holding forward on the joystick. Other than that, the gameplay is largely the same, which is fine, because the base game's combat was already great. Alright, now I'm really going to get into spoilers for Future Connected, so if you haven't left already and you haven't played it, again, I highly suggest you do so. The story was actually a lot better than I was expecting. When they revealed the DLC chapter, I was honestly a little hesitant. I don't like it when developers tack sequels onto the end of an already satisfying story, and if recent events have shown anything, it's that you can very easily ruin the legacy of one game by trying to cram in a sequel. Going into this game, I really wasn't sure how the story would make sense, since in the base game it already felt like you fixed the problems the world had, but it actually made a lot more sense than I thought. Melia and Shulk return to the top of Bionis to see what happened to Alchemoth after the original game. The people there are still struggling to get along with each other, as racial tensions from the recent war are still high. It actually made a lot of sense that just because we beat the big bad guy in the first game, it doesn't mean that everyone's ready to move on from years of violence. The world is also unstable after the events of the original game, and the fabric of reality is still being formed. Shulk and Melia have to work together to figure out what's going on and close some mysterious transspatial rift, because it's making all of the local monsters in the area go crazy and attack the villagers. I was expecting a sudden villain to pop out and feel forced and out of place, but the story actually does a pretty good job of feeling like a reasonable thing that would happen after the first game. There is this one clown who kind of shows up and feels out of place, but he's inoffensive enough. It also opens up pretty well for a sequel, if the developers are so inclined. See, the fabric of reality is basically torn open, and it kind of opens the door for anything to happen. This dude also gets away, and we don't get any closure as to where he goes, so he's probably still lurking around causing trouble. And we really didn't get any answers as to why this phenomenon was happening. Like I said, sequels can be pretty risky, but I love this game, and the other two sequels have done really well, so I trust them with another one and would be super excited to play it. Overall, though, the sequel chapter really does give Melia a great sense of closure on her situation in the story, even bridging the gap with her half-sister Tyrea. Melia was my favorite character in the base game, so giving her a satisfying conclusion was great. They also made her a total badass in this game. So anyway, yeah, that's Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. The story was pretty great and kept me invested, the gameplay was innovative and fun, and the sequel chapter was definitely worth revisiting the game for. I loved playing it so much that it's actually gotten me to want to try Xenoblade Chronicles 2 again, even though I really didn't care for the gameplay the first time through. As far as games of this genre go, it's easily in my top 3 alongside Persona 4 and 5. If you haven't played it already, I highly suggest you give it a shot. In my opinion, it really is one of the best JRPGs of all time.